By the time people started saying it out loud, it was already true. They didn't whisper anymore, not always. Sometimes they spoke carefully, lowering their voices when I passed. Sometimes they didn't bother. My name carried weight now, not because of who I was, but because of who stood beside me. I felt it in the way conversations paused when I entered a room alone, in the way eyes searched behind me first, then relaxed when they found her, in the way silence followed me down hallways that used to buzz with careless noise. Social pressure didn't announce itself, it accumulated. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that this was what visibility felt like after years of being overlooked. But visibility didn't usually come with this kind of restraint, this kind of calculation. When I froze in place, at a doorway, at a question, at a sudden sound, she noticed before anyone else. She didn't comment. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply stepped closer, close enough that my shoulders loosened without permission. Hope flickered. Then it dimmed. There were moments, small, treacherous moments, when she softened. A hand hovering near my elbow without touching. A pause in her stride so I could catch up. Her coat draped over my shoulders one evening when the temperature dropped unexpectedly. I felt myself lean toward those moments, hungry for them, and just as quickly, she pulled back. The warmth vanished, the silence sharpened, the distance returned, measured and intentional. It left me off balance every time, unsure what I'd done to cause the shift. That uncertainty began to follow me into sleep. I started waking up tense, heart racing, replaying conversations for mistakes I couldn't name. The patterns were familiar in a way I didn't like, familiar enough to make my chest ache with something dangerously close to recognition. One afternoon, I heard my name again, this time followed by laughter that didn't bother to hide itself. "She thinks she's protected," someone said. "Like that's permanent." Another voice responded, lower. "Nothing is permanent with her." I stood still, my body locking up before my mind could catch up. The old instinct flared. Don't move, don't react, don't give them anything. When she appeared beside me moments later, the laughter stopped mid-syllable. She didn't look at them, she looked at me. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question felt heavy, loaded, as if there was a right answer and a wrong one. "I'm fine," I said automatically. She held my gaze for a second longer than usual. Something unreadable passed across her face. "Good," she replied, "because people like that don't stop unless they're corrected." The word landed hard. Corrected. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the paint like constellations. My thoughts drifted back years without my permission, to rooms where silence had kept the peace, to apologies that had smoothed over danger, to the relief of knowing what was expected of me so I could survive it. I told myself this was different, but the feeling in my chest argued otherwise. The next day, she asked where I'd be after my last class. "Probably the library," I said. "I have a paper to start." "I'll walk you," she said. It wasn't a question. At the library entrance, I hesitated, just for a moment, long enough to feel the weight of choice settle in my bones. "You don't have to," I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in focus. "I know," she replied. She waited. I went inside. We sat across from each other in silence, the long table between us empty except for my books. She didn't open anything. She didn't pretend to work. She watched the room, alert, contained, like she was guarding a perimeter only she could see. The air felt thick. I tried to concentrate, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her presence, to the way it filled the space, demanded awareness. Every time someone passed too close, her posture shifted. Every time I flinched, her jaw tightened. Hope flickered again, that dangerous, warming thing. Then came the doubt. I closed my notebook, the sound sharper than I intended. "Why me?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, taut enough to snap. I wondered if I'd crossed a line, if questions were a mistake. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "Because you don't fight," she said, "and people mistake that for weakness." The words sank in slowly. "That's not always true," I replied. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." Something about her tone made my skin prickle. There was approval there, and something else. Something that felt too close to possession. When I stood to leave, she stood too. When I turned toward the exit, she fell into step beside me without hesitation. Outside, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and gray. We stopped near the steps, the space between us narrow enough that I could feel her warmth. "If you ever leave me," she said calmly, her voice steady, almost gentle, "I won't stop what happens next." The words didn't sound like a threat. That was what made them terrifying. I stared at her, my mind scrambling for meaning, for context, for anything that made this feel less real. She met my gaze without blinking, her expression composed, resolute. The world around us kept moving. Students passed, laughter drifted through the air. No one noticed the way my chest tightened, the way the familiar freeze wrapped itself around my spine. I nodded. Not because I agreed, because my body remembered what came next when I didn't. As she walked away, the warmth she left behind felt thinner than it ever had before. And for the first time since arriving here, the safety I'd been clinging to felt like something that could close instead of open. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, her words replayed themselves. Measured, calm, impossible to misinterpret once they settled. They didn't echo like a threat shouted in anger. They stayed, precise and controlled, the way facts do when you can't argue with them. By morning, my body felt hollowed out. Not panicked, alert. That was new. Fear had always made me small. This felt different, like something in me had shifted from enduring to watching. I moved through campus carefully that day, more aware of my surroundings than usual. Not because I was afraid of others, but because I was afraid of how easily I'd stopped questioning the way things had narrowed around me. I started noticing patterns I'd ignored before, how often she appeared at exactly the right moment, how conversations stopped not just when she arrived, but when her name was mentioned, how people adjusted their behavior without being asked. Power didn't need to announce itself. It trained people quietly. In class, I caught myself taking notes I didn't need, not academic ones, observations, times, reactions. Who looked relieved when she left a room? Who looked tense when she entered? It wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. At lunch, I sat alone for the first time in weeks. The table felt too big, too exposed. My hands shook slightly as I unwrapped my food. I waited for the familiar pressure to return, for her presence to settle beside me like it always did. It didn't. The absence was loud. I told myself this was good, necessary, that I needed to remember how to exist without leaning on someone else's shadow. Halfway through my meal, someone sat across from me. Not her, a classmate, one I barely knew. She smiled, tentative but genuine. "I haven't seen you around much," she said. "I wasn't sure if—" She trailed off, glancing over my shoulder. I followed her gaze instinctively. No one was there. "I'm still here," I said. The words surprised me. She smiled again, more easily this time. We talked, about assignments, about the weather, about nothing that mattered. It felt awkward, uneven, real. When I stood to leave, my legs felt steadier than they had in days. That afternoon, I went back to my room and pulled the box out from under my bed. I hadn't opened it in years. Not because I'd forgotten what was inside, but because I'd promised myself I wouldn't need it anymore. Inside were notebooks, old phones, screenshots printed and organized with careful precision, patterns documented quietly, methodically, proof gathered not for revenge, but for survival. I sat on the floor and flipped through them slowly. The language was familiar. Not the words, but the structure. The escalation disguised as care. The isolation framed as protection. The certainty presented as love. My chest tightened, but I didn't look away. That night, she texted, "Where are you?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, studying. The lie came easily. That scared me more than the truth ever had. "Be careful," she wrote back. Always. The word felt heavy. Over the next few days, I practiced being smaller in her presence and larger everywhere else. I didn't challenge her. I didn't confront her. I listened. I observed. I learned how she controlled rooms without raising her voice, how she corrected people with silence, how she rewarded loyalty with proximity and punished deviation with withdrawal. I learned how quickly people adjusted when they thought no one was watching. And I learned something else. She underestimated me, not out of arrogance, out of assumption. She saw my quiet as absence, my restraint as emptiness. She didn't see the way my mind cataloged details, the way my memory held onto moments most people dismissed. One evening, after a long walk back from class, she stopped me near the edge of campus. "You've been distant," she said. The accusation was gentle, practiced. "I've been busy," I replied. Her eyes searched my face, looking for something. Fear, maybe. Compliance. She found neither. "You don't need to hide things from me," she said. I nodded. "I know." We stood there in silence, the space between us charged. For the first time, I felt something like resolve settle into my bones. That night, I sent an email. No name attached, no explanation, just files, timelines, patterns, enough to raise questions that couldn't be ignored once asked. My finger hovered over the send button longer than I expected. Then I pressed it. The room didn't change. The world didn't end. My phone didn't buzz with consequences. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, not with fear but with something sharper. Agency. When my phone finally lit up hours later, it wasn't from her. It was an automated reply. Message received. I closed my eyes and let the breath I'd been holding escape slowly. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was preparing to speak, and almost, I stopped myself. The notice arrived without ceremony. An email, plain subject line, mandatory attendance requested, no names mentioned, no accusations spelled out, just a date, a time, and a room I'd passed 100 times without ever imagining I'd sit inside it. My hands went cold as I read it. I told myself I didn't have to go. That anonymity meant distance, that whatever I'd sent would exist without me. But my body already knew better. Some choices don't end when you make them. They follow you forward. The room was smaller than I expected. Fluorescent lights, a long table, neutral walls meant to make everything said inside feel procedural instead of personal. They'd arranged the chairs carefully, space between each one, like boundaries drawn in furniture. She was already there. She didn't look surprised to see me. That hurt more than if she had. Her posture was relaxed, arms folded loosely, gaze steady. The same calm she always carried. The same certainty. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the danger, if this was all a misunderstanding that would resolve itself neatly. Then the questions started. They didn't accuse. They asked, clarifying questions, contextual ones. They spoke in careful language that turned harm into patterns and fear into data points. I listened as fragments of her history surfaced, disciplinary actions framed as miscommunications, complaints dismissed for lack of corroboration, warnings that never reached consequences. She answered each one smoothly, precisely, no wasted words. I recognized the technique, control through composure. When my turn came, my throat tightened. The old instinct surged. Stay quiet, let it pass, don't draw attention. My hands curled into my sleeves, fingers pressing into familiar fabric like an anchor. I met her eyes instead. She was watching me closely now. Not with anger, with calculation. I spoke carefully, not emotionally. I described patterns, timelines, the way things escalated without ever appearing to. The room stayed quiet as I talked. Pens paused, eyes lifted. She shifted for the first time when I mentioned isolation, not denial, recognition. I didn't say her name. I didn't need to. They had the files, the messages, the corroboration that came after my submission opened a door others had been waiting to step through. Voices layered over mine, hesitant at first, then steadier, stories that mirrored each other too closely to be coincidence. I felt something break open in my chest. She looked at me then, not cold, not controlled, bare. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an apology. It was disappointment. "I tried not to," I replied. The truth of that landed heavier than anything else I'd said. The meeting ended without resolution. They never do. Institutions move slowly, even when harm is obvious. Especially then. But the shift had happened. I could feel it in the room, in the way the air seemed less willing to hold her certainty. Outside, the hallway felt too bright. She followed me. We stopped near the stairwell, the same one where I'd once overheard warnings I didn't understand yet. She stood close enough that I could feel the heat of her anger now, contained, furious, betrayed. You think this ends well? She asked. I swallowed. No. Her jaw tightened. Then why? Because I couldn't unsee it anymore. Because safety that erases you isn't safety. Because silence doesn't protect, it preserves. I didn't say any of that. I'm sorry, I said instead. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not of consequences, of loss. She turned away without another word, leaving me alone with the echo of what we'd almost been and the certainty that there was no going back. As I walked out into the afternoon light, my legs trembled beneath me. I'd expected relief, victory, something clean. What I felt instead was grief. For the version of myself who'd believed protection meant care. For the version of her who might have been something else if power hadn't taught her how to keep people instead of love them. Behind me, a door closed softly, and with it, the last illusion that this could have ended gently. She was gone before anyone said the word. No announcement, no confrontation in public spaces, no satisfying conclusion for the people who liked their justice loud and visible. One day, her seat was empty. The next, her name stopped coming up in conversations, spoken only in lowered voices, like saying it too clearly might bring something back. The campus adjusted the way it always did, efficiently, quietly, without ceremony. I noticed the absence everywhere. In the cafeteria, the space beside me filled again, not immediately, not comfortably, but it did fill. People sat where they hadn't before, laughed where they'd once been careful. The perimeter that had surrounded me for weeks dissolved without explanation. That should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like vertigo. I kept expecting her to appear, at the edge of a room, at the corner of my vision, stepping in just before something tipped too far. My body still braced for her presence, even when my mind reminded me she wasn't coming. The first time someone brushed past me without consequence, I flinched hard enough to draw attention. Sorry, I said automatically. They smiled, confused but kind, and kept walking. I stood there longer than necessary, my chest tight, trying to understand why the relief didn't come. The systems that had made space for her power were still intact. The rules that rewarded silence hadn't changed. People were friendlier now, yes, but careful too, as if the lesson they'd learned wasn't about harm, but about proximity. I started speaking more in class, not confidently, not loudly, but I raised my hand, I asked questions, my voice shook sometimes. I let it. No one corrected me. That felt like something I'd earned instead of something I'd been granted. Still, the nights were the hardest. Without the structure of her presence, my thoughts wandered freely again, and they didn't always land gently. I replayed conversations, searching for moments I'd missed, for alternatives that might have cost less. I wondered if I'd misunderstood her, if I'd exaggerated danger where there had only been intensity. That doubt was familiar. It sat comfortably beside guilt. One evening, as I packed up my bag in the library, my phone vibrated. A message preview appeared on the screen. Unknown number. My hands went cold. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it, bracing for impact. You survived. Just 2 words. No accusation, no explanation, no demand. My chest tightened, grief and anger tangling together until I couldn't separate them. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another. None of the words felt right. Nothing I could say would restore what had been broken or undo what had been necessary. I set the phone down without replying. Outside, the campus lights flickered on, illuminating paths I was learning to walk without anyone clearing them for me. Each step felt heavier than it should have. Each choice required effort I wasn't used to spending. Later, in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the quiet settle. Not the structured silence she'd brought with her, but the unguarded kind. The kind that didn't promise safety, only space. I wondered if I'd destroyed the only protection I'd ever known. The thought scared me more than I wanted to admit. But when I imagined going back, imagined shrinking again, apologizing more, listening less, I felt something else rise up alongside the fear. Refusal. Whatever came next, it would be uneven, uncomfortable, mine. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, breathing through the unfamiliar weight of freedom, knowing one thing with certainty. Healing didn't feel like victory. It felt like learning how to stand in rooms without someone deciding where you belonged. And somewhere deep in that realization, I understood that even in her absence, She had changed me. The question was whether I'd let that change finish the work she'd started or finally undo it. The campus didn't remember her the way I did. Time moved on the way it always does, efficiently, indifferently. New rumors replaced old ones. New names took up space where hers once had. By the end of the semester, her absence felt normal to everyone but me. I carried it quietly, not like a wound, more like a pressure change, something you only notice when you stop bracing against it. I walked differently now, slower, less angled toward exits. I still chose seats at the edges of rooms, still mapped spaces instinctively, but the calculations no longer revolved around her presence or absence. They revolved around me. Some days that felt like progress. Other days, it felt like standing in the middle of an open field with no shelter in sight. People spoke to me more easily, invited me to sit with them, asked my opinion, and waited for the answer instead of talking over it. I noticed how careful I was not to mistake this for safety. Kindness wasn't protection, and protection, when it erased you, wasn't kindness either. I learned to let silence exist without rushing to fill it, learned that I could pause without apologizing. The words still hovered on my tongue sometimes, old reflexes slow to fade, but I caught them more often now. That counted for something. There were moments, small, unexpected ones, when I missed her. The certainty, the way the world bent around her decisions, the relief of knowing someone else was watching so I didn't have to. I didn't like admitting that. Missing the feeling didn't mean I missed the cost. It meant I was honest enough to name what had once felt like shelter, even when it wasn't. I never replied to her message. Not because I didn't care, because responding would have reopened a door I'd closed with effort and consequence. Some endings only hold if you let them stay incomplete. One afternoon, near the end of term, I found myself at the edge of campus, where the paths thinned out and the noise softened. I stopped there often now, not to wait, but to think. The air was cool, the sky overcast, the kind of day that made everything feel suspended between before and after. I stood there longer than I needed to. For a moment, I imagined her beside me, silent, watchful, deciding which direction we'd take next. The image came easily, too easily. Then I let it go. I stepped forward alone. My heart beat faster than it should have, but it didn't stop me. The fear was familiar, manageable. It no longer dictated my movement. Behind me, the campus carried on, unaware of the quiet shift taking place. Ahead of me, the path opened without promise, without protection, without certainty. I walked anyway. And though I didn't look back right away, I knew that part of me always would.